Like we said before, we need to find a method. We need to develop a method for solving linear systems that utilizes the efficient representation in an augmented matrix, knowing that each row represents an equation. And so let's first start with this linear system and write down its augmented matrix. I'm going to go by column because it's easier to line things up that way. So the first column will be 0, -1, -2, 1. So 0, first column is going to be 0, -1, -2, 1. The second column will be the x2 column, so that'll be -3, -2, -3, and 4. The third column will be for my x3s. I'll have a -6, a -1, a 0, and a 5. Then the x4 column will be 4, 3, 3, -9. I'm going to remind myself that this is an augmented matrix, and I'm going to put the constants on the rightmost column. 9, 1, -1, -7. Our strategy is going to be, our general strategy is to get a 1 in the upper left, then use that 1 to zero out the rest of the column. So our strategy is going to be get a 1 in the upper left, and then use that 1 to zero out the column. This is just me using local vernacular. Zero out the column. I'm going to get a 1 in the first row, and I'm going to use that 1 to zero out the rest of that x1 column. I'm going to eliminate x1 from the rest of the system. Even though we go in here and x1 is already out of the first equation, I'm going to use one of these other equations to get rid of x1 from all those. This is called a pivot. So this upper left corner is a pivot position. That's our first pivot. That's our first pivot. So here's what I'm going to do. I see that there's a 1 down here in row 4. I'm going to interchange row 2 and row 4. I'm just rewriting the system so that the 4th row is first and the first row is 4th. There are other things I could do. I could put the second row on top and then just multiply by -1. Those are legal moves in an equation, so I won't change the solution set. But I want to switch row 4 and row 1 so I don't have to change any signs because that's dangerous. We're going to miss a sign somewhere and then everything falls apart. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take row 4 and move it up to row 1. Row 4 is going to become my new row 1. And I'm going to write the entire augmented matrix with that one change. So my augmented matrix is now, the first row is going to become 1, 4, 5, -9, -7. My second row is not going to change. And my first row is now my 4th row. 0, -3, -6, 4, 9. Remind myself this is an augmented matrix and use matrix notation with the brackets. Now, the question is, what happened to the pivot? But when we talk about pivots, we want to talk about pivot positions in the matrix. So this 1 is still the pivot position. This is the pivot. It's that location in the matrix, not the 0 from the row. It's that location in the matrix. It's a position in the matrix. So it's a position in the matrix. Now, what we're going to do is use that 1 to zero out the rest of the column. So I have a 1 in the first row, first column. I want to use this 1 to get a 0 in the first column, second row, first column. To do that, I will take row 1 and just add it to row 2, and that'll be my new row 2. Row 1 plus row 2 is going to be my new row 2. So, doing a pivot, my first row is not going to change. My second row is going to be 1 and 1, oh, sorry, 1 minus 1 is 0. 4 minus 2 is 2. 5 minus 1 is 4. Negative 9 and 3 is negative 6. Negative 7 and 1 is negative 6. That's my new row 2. I use that 1 to get a 0 in row 2. I also want to use that 1 to get a 0 in row 3. So I need to cancel out a negative 2 with a 1. So I'll take 2 times the first row and add it to row 3, and that'll be my new row 3. So I'm going to write 2 times the first row would look like a 2, 8, 10, negative 18, and negative 14. So 2 minus 2 is 0. 8 minus 3 is 5. 10 plus 0 is 10. Negative 18 and 3 is negative 15. Negative 14 minus 1 is negative 15. And right now, if we know where this is headed, we should see what's going on with these two equations. We can see these two equations are not adding anything. We only need one of these equations. We don't need both of these because the second one, the third row, is just 5 halves of the second row. So if you don't see that, that's okay. We'll find out. I didn't have to do anything to get a 0 in the third row. And so now this first pivot is complete. I have a 1 and zeros below. So here the first pivot is complete. So I'm going to move to the left and down and try to pivot there and see if I can. So left and down in the second row, second column, I see that there's a 2 there. I want to turn that into a 1 and use it to zero out the rest of the column. So my next pivot, since there's not a 0 in this 2, and I don't have to move anything around, I'm going to pivot here on this 2. That's my next pivot position. There's my next pivot position. I need to make a 1 there and use that 1 to get to zero out the rest of the column. I can get a 1 there by dividing that row by 2. So I'm just going to take 1/2 of row 2 as my new row 2. So 1/2 of row 2 is my new row 2. Everything else is going to stay the same. If you're thinking, man, this is tedious, I hope I can automate this on my calculator, the answer is no, you have to do it by hand every single time. I'm just kidding, that's ridiculous. It's going to be 1, 4, 5, negative 9, negative 7. My new row 2 is going to be 0, 1, 2, negative 3, negative 3. My third row is going to stay the same, even though we know that this is going to zero itself out, and my fourth row is going to stay the same, and this one will not zero out. So I did a pivot here. First row, first column. Second row, second column. There are my pivots. So the next pivot position, I want to go upper left to any upper left that I haven't done. So you start in row 1, column 1. Once you complete that pivot, we move on to row 2, column 2, if we can pivot there. And we'll do an example next time when we can't pivot there. So we add one row, add one column. For next pivot. Next pivot, no. Clearly it must be 11 o'clock because subconsciously I might go, nope, stop. So we move over and down to the, to the right and down for the next pivot and see if we can pivot there. And in this case, we can. So now I'm not going to do all these row operations, but we're going to list what we need to do. I want to use this one to zero out the rest of the column. So my first row will need to be a -4 times row 2 and add that to row 1. So -4 row 2 plus row 1 is my new row 1. Notice that because I have a 0 in the first column, nothing is going to change in the first column when I pivot with this 1. So this 0, because there's a 0 in the first column, nothing's going to change in the first column. So I do -4 row 2 plus row 1 is my new row 1. I have to do -5 row 2 plus row 3. That'll be my new row 3. -5, -5 row 2 plus row 3 is my new row 3. Once again, the first column is not going to change. This is going to stay 1 with all these zeros. And then the other thing I need to do is 3 times row 2 plus row 3 is my new row 3.
Isn't it row 4?
Row 4. 3 row 2 plus row 4, yes. Three row 2 plus row 4 is my new row 4. So looking ahead, what we want to happen is we want to keep a 1 here, and then I want zeros above and below. Pivoting in this second row is not going to change anything in the first row. If you start doing pivots and where you had zeros before, they start going away, you're going in the wrong order. So what the new augmented matrix looks like So the new augmented matrix will look like 1, 0, -3, 0, 5. I'm just going to write this down. 1, 0, -3, 0, 5. And you can check my arithmetic. The second row is going to be, oops, I missed a step. One, 0, -3, 3, 5. My second row is not going to change because that's where I'm doing the pivot. 1, 0, 2, -3, -3. My third row is going to be all zeros after I do that pivot. And my fourth row will be 0, 0, 0, -5, 0. So now the second pivot is complete. I pivoted on this first row, first column, second row, second column. Now I move to the third row, third column, and I realize I can't get a 1 here without breaking some zeros that I already got. My first and second columns are now complete. I cannot pivot in the third column. If I move the 2 down, I break the zeros that I worked so hard for. If I move the -3 down, I'll break this 0 that I worked so hard for. We cannot put a pivot in third column. Cannot pivot the third column. without breaking zeros. In columns 1 and 2. We worked so hard to get to zero out those columns. We don't want to pivot in, we want to try to put a pivot in the third row, third column, because it'll break the things that we worked so hard for. So we go on to the fourth column. We're going to go to the third row, fourth column. And in the third row, fourth column, we can get a pivot there by moving row 4 up to row 3. We're actually going to take negative 1/5 of row 4 and move it into row 3. Now, rather than trying to remember this as a process, think about what the goal is. The goal is to make each column, every column that we can, a 1 with zeros everywhere else, a 1 with zeros everywhere else. We can't make a 1 with zeros everywhere else in this third column without breaking the zeros that we had in the first 2. So we go to the fourth column. Can I get a 1 in this position with the stuff below it? And yeah, the negative 5 can push up into there and divide by 1/5. So then we'll use that 1 to get zeros above and below, and then we'll have the reduced row echelon form. So there's a video where I do this, and there's also old notes where I do this problem because I just keep using this problem over and over again. Like I said, teachers are lazy, and we try to recycle. I'll phrase it that way. I'll frame it that way. We like to be green and recycle our old examples. This also keeps us from having to learn new things and be creative. All right, so let's pause the video here and leave the rest of the reduced echelon form to you, the reader. And then we'll talk about what the result is on Wednesday. Let's pause the video here